Hello, and welcome to another episode of Breaking the Guard. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about how I would normally teach a class. And this is going to be useful, I think, for people who are instructors, of course, and coaches, as well as for students, just to kind of understand where I'm coming from. Again, last episode, I was making a critique of the ecological approach. So I think it's only fair if I outline what I consider to be following the traditional model of teaching a class, at least the way I would do it. To start off, you have warming up. Now, back in the day, I used to do lots of warm-ups, 10, 15 minutes of warming up, because I grew up under wrestling, and in wrestling, the warm-up is a big deal. But my school of thought has changed since my early wrestling days, and now I think warming up is not as important, not something that we have to throw a lot of time into doing motions that are not relevant to the sport. So I tend to make the warm-ups much shorter. There's another thing I have to caveat that with, is that whenever I'm going to train, I warm up myself before I show up to train. So I take it as my responsibility to do the warm-up that I know works for me. So if I come to the gym, I don't need to rely on the coach doing a warm-up that works for me because, for example, in my particular case, I need some mobility work, particularly with my spine. You guys probably heard me before, like my spine's very rigid, so I don't twist well, I don't bend like I used to. And I do like a yoga style warm-up. I've mentioned it several times in the past. You can look it up on the website, davidmma.com. If you look up bed yoga, that's what I do before every training session. It takes anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes, depending on how much time I want to spend. But before any training session, I'm doing that, and I usually do it at home. I go in my garage, I warm up, and then I drive to the gym. If they have their own warm-up, then I'll do it also. But that's just icing on the cake at this point. I feel if you're serious about your training, you probably know what things your body needs. And I find generally when you're an athlete, you're younger, you probably don't need those specific motions. Again, I'm 43, I've accumulated a good amount of damage over the years, so I have to try to counteract some of the consequences of that. And I can't rely on it, and I could be honest, none of the warm-ups I've ever done would be useful for me in that regard. Most of the warm-ups I see being done in practices tend to be about actually physically warming you up, right? Like, okay, we're gonna do big jumps for shots, when we're doing things that are good for athletes to work on, like explosiveness or coordination type stuff, like doing cartwheels or whatnot. But that's not going to really mobilize you if you need to open up your body a bit more. And I think that's going to be more specific on an individual basis. I can't do a mobility routine that's going to hit everybody the same or address all the needs that each individual person has because all of our bodies are very different. So I feel now at this age, I've come to understand like everybody's mobility needs are going to be different, so their warm-up and their mobilization is going to be different. So I'm not going to waste a lot of time trying to do that. So if we're doing warm-ups, it's going to be just to get you literally warmed up, right? And very basic things like, you're running around and the shots, the forward rolls, stuff that anybody can do that you don't have to be particularly loose for, just to get you a little bit warmed up. I wouldn't spend more than 5 minutes doing that, to be honest. Just really quick, just to get you a little bit loose. Like I said, hopefully you've done more of that on your own. And there's nothing stopping you from showing up early at the gym to warm up or stretch or do what you have to do. Again, that's just my take. I've seen most of the gyms that I work at now that are higher level have the same attitude. I know the new wave guys have zero warm-ups. They just go right into drills because if you want to warm up, you do it on your own, right? And people do show up early to stretch and to roll out whatever they have going on with them. And that's what I was doing when I was there as well. And I know my brother independently was doing that on his own, where they kind of killed the warm-ups, because I think, one, as a student, if you're showing up to a class that's an hour long or maybe an hour 15 minutes long, and the coach is spending 30 minutes warming you up, it's kind of wasting your time in a way. Because like, yeah, I need the warm-up, but I really need more the instruction, right? So I feel that you're going to give more value to your students if you're investing it more into technical instruction, drilling, sparring, those sort of things which they need an instructor to lead, versus just a warm-up which could be done on their own. Again, I don't see anything wrong with having a longer warm-up if your goal is conditioning in mind, right? Now, there's also ways of warming people up with drills. And that's, I think, a better way of warming people up, because now you're warming them up and you're also doing something that's sport specific. It's also building skill. So that's a great way to warm up. However, certain drills, you're going to have to be warmed up beforehand, right? Especially, like I said, in my case, for me to move the right way, I need to mobilize. So that's why, again, I think if you fall under that case like me, where like you're stiffer, maybe you're a bit older, and like you feel like the warm-ups really save you, like in my case I do, then you should probably be showing up early anyways, just so you can get the right stretches, the right exercises, the right mobilizations, so you feel 100% starting the training session. And then whatever else coach throws at you is just icing on the cake. That's my take anyway. So the warm-up phase, again, for me, if I'm structuring class, about 5 minutes. That's all I want there. Next part of the class, again, depends on the goal of the class. If I want to get into some drilling, that would be a good time for it, right? Where if we covered material from a previous class, let's get that and let's drill that. And this could be as simple as, what people are now labeling as static drilling, where your partner just stays there and one guy is getting the work in and you can go back and forth or whatnot. I'm going to do another podcast specifically on my drilling strategies. So I'm not going to, and that's a bigger topic, so I don't want to put too much time in there. But we can do like a static drill. We could also do like a rehearsed drill where we're going to go back and forth during the drill. For example, I shoot in, he sprawls, I peek out, he pulls guard, I'm going to pass a guard, he does a technical stand-up, and then we start back on our feet, right? And then that would be like 1 rep. And now the other guy will lead, right? So the A and B man have different roles in this drill, but they're both working different skills. So it's good that you can switch back and forth. And again, this is another type of drill that you could do. And you could have things about reacting, like maybe you have somebody who's, and again, we're doing an MMA class, both of us are in striking stances, and I'm waiting for him to throw his first jab, right? And when I get the timing for the jab, right, once he throws it, boom, I slip, go into a double leg, right? So now I'm building reaction time, right? And I'm recognizing threats, and my partner is giving me a cue, right? So I feel that's another good drill, and again, works for both guys. We can combine that with the rehearsed style where I throw the punch, and again, after he goes for the shot, now I'm going into a sprawl, right? Stuff like that. So these are some examples of drills. And again, the goal of drills for me, refine technique, build power, which is a combination of both speed and strength, and to build timing, reactions, right? So in those few examples, we could have done those 3. How much time would I spend in drilling? Again, depending on the class length. If you have a 90-minute class, maybe 10 minutes of drilling. If it's an hour, maybe it's shorter, like 5, or you could still go 10 minutes. So again, at a minimum 5, just to get, again, part of the warm-up, you could say, right? Or like extend the second part of the warm-up, if you will. or you just really want to focus on people building those skills that you just taught them in a previous class. So you can give them more time, maybe 10 minutes to work, right? And that's a good amount of time, right? You could go longer, but I feel then it's going to eat up what you could do with the rest of the class, right? Especially if we're considering an hour-long class. So I feel like 5 minutes for just a pure warming up, calisthenics, jogging around, that type of thing. 5 to 10 minutes on drilling, whether it's static, whether it's rehearsed, whether it's doing timing stuff. The next part of the class, instruction. Now I will sit down and I'm going to start teaching. And I feel this is going to take a good chunk of the class, right? Because this is the part that I'm leading. And for the student, probably the most valuable part, because this is where I'm going to be dumping knowledge, right? And this is also where they're going to be able to ask questions and get feedback from me. So I feel in a class, I probably want to spend somewhere between 20 to 30 minutes on instruction. I don't want to show a lot of technique. If I show too much, they're going to forget a lot of it, right? I feel the sweet spot for me tends to be somewhere between 3 to 5, right? I usually try to aim for 4, but somewhere between 3 techniques to 5 techniques. And it's going to depend on the complexity of the technique, of course, and also how receptive the students are to learning it. Sometimes I might teach something and everybody is nailing it like very quickly, especially if it's building upon previous content that I've taught. So then I can speed up. Okay, we don't need to do as many reps practicing this because everybody's kind of got it, so we can move on. So I can cover more content. But if I see people, it's a new concept and they're struggling with it, okay, we're going to show less now because we really need to focus on making sure we can build a good practical understanding of these techniques. As far as how I would like to teach, follow a very simple formula. I want to be able to first give the importance of whatever I'm teaching, right? So I'm going to talk about what it is I'm teaching, why am I teaching it. I'm trying to lead my audience to want to be very interested in paying attention, right? I know people have all sorts of things going on in their life. Sometimes people don't want to be lectured to. They like learning hands-on. They might be thinking about what's going on at work or what they're going to do after this. So I want to try to make a little sales pitch right before I teach a technique to get people's ears perked up and paying attention. All right, so I might talk about how I use this technique to win a bronze medal, or Israel Adesanya knocked somebody out with this kick, right? Or and people, oh, okay, this is kind of cool, right? I should be paying attention. So I want to have a good lead-in for whatever I'm teaching. I'm then going to demonstrate it. And this is important because rather than me trying to break the move down piece by piece, which is going to take a long time, typically, or not a long time, but a longer amount of time, if I show the move first, now people know exactly what it's supposed to look like in full speed. Then I'm going to break it down after I demonstrate it. And I break this rule sometimes, but usually if you see me teaching, this is what I'm going to try to do. I'm going to try to demonstrate first, and then I'll break it down. So I want a demonstration at normal speed, so everybody can see, oh, okay, this is what this is. And then I'll start breaking it down piece by piece. Let's say I was talking about my favorite subject, kimuras, and I was doing a kimura from top side control. So I would go, okay, here we're going to do this submission starting from top side control. This is what it's going to look like. And boom, boom, I'll do it. All right, now let's talk about the individual parts, right? And I'll say, okay, first, we're going to control the wrist, have to pin it to the ground, and I'm basically going to lay out each component of the move. How am I getting to this position? How am I controlling this position? Where are my pins? Where's my body weight being pressed? And also, why am I doing all these different motions? Like, what's the importance of this? What's the most important component of this technique? So I'm trying to give people not only the idea to be able just to see it, right? Because if they just see it, they're just going to mimic without understanding, I'm also explaining and breaking down each part of the move so everybody understands why this works, right? Kimura is a shoulder lock, right? And we're rotating the shoulder to overextension, which is going to cause the ligaments and tendons to start tearing, and that's going to create the pressure to make someone tap, right? And then how we're doing that? Well, we're going to isolate, pin the wrist, we're going to pin the shoulder, elevate the elbow. When we do those things, that's going to cause the shoulder to get damaged. Okay, now how do we pin the wrist? How do we pin the shoulder? Then I'll explain, okay, we can use our hands to control this, we can use our chest to pin here, and we can use our figure 4 grip to elevate the elbow, right? And I can talk about the intricacies of the grip. I go into a lot of effort to explain every part of the move. Again, why I don't want to show a lot of moves at once. Because especially the more complicated moves, they have a lot of moving parts, and just doing one move is going to be difficult. If I try to teach 20 moves in a class, you're going to lose people, right? So teach the move, break it down, and the final part is go over common mistakes. This is something I believe my brother had taught me, and if you watched, especially in my earlier courses, I made a big deal of teaching at least 3 other common mistakes because they just are so common, people are going to make them without realizing they're making them. So it's a good area to, if you know like the common problems people have with a technique, highlight it, right? Even if I showed everything perfectly, we know that you don't receive things well the first time around. Anybody who's read a book knows that when you read it the second time, you learn more about it, right? You find things you see things you didn't see before, right? You're able to pay attention to other details that eluded you the first reading. And learning techniques is the same. And usually when a move is a little more complex, there's going to be certain parts of the technique that everybody misses. These are the common mistakes, right? So it's a good idea to highlight those, to put special attention so that people will know, oh, okay, this is where I might make a mistake. And then finally, the last part of the instruction is getting questions, right? I want to make sure that nobody in the class has questions. I try to do as much as I can to eliminate questions, obviously, because if I have to answer 20 questions, the class is going to take too long, right? And that probably means I didn't do a good job explaining the move. Or I've made an environment that people are terrified of asking a question, so nobody asks. And it's also going to behoove you to walk around after I teach a technique and I've answered all the questions, to walk around, make sure that everybody's doing the technique properly, because most people are shy and self-conscious about asking questions, right? I feel like for every one person that asked a question, there were 5 more that wanted that same question asked, but were too shy to ask, right? They felt, oh, I'm going to look stupid, or oh, that, and that's usually what it is. Honestly, people feel that they're going to look stupid asking the question, and they'll just hope they figure it out on their own, right? And again, I try to do my best not to make anybody feel dumb or inferior because they have questions. Like, no, ask, please, because sometimes these questions are really good, and if you can ask a question that will stump me, that's going to force me to become a better coach, because now I have to figure out the answer to that question. The other thing as a coach that you have to figure out is also how to teach the same thing in many ways, or and this might be in the demonstration itself. This also might be in the explanation, right? Because everybody has a different way of learning. I notice sometimes when I'm walking around a class and somebody is doing a move wrong, I will do the move to them. And them feeling the move done right clicks light bulbs, right? Like, oh, okay, I feel that pressure, and they understand it. So these are people that need tactile pressure, right? Like they learn by feel. So just watching me wasn't enough. They need to feel the move. And then some people just, like I said, are too timid to ask questions. So when you walk around, they'll ask you the question face to face. They don't want to ask when the whole class is watching. All right, so I try to make myself available as I'm walking around to make sure that everybody understands the move. In most cases, technical demonstration should be, for one technique, somewhere about 5 minutes or so, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, again, depending how complicated the move is. and how many questions are being asked. Typically, when I teach, I'm usually only fielding one, maybe two questions, right? And I feel that's a fair amount, right? I wouldn't want to have too many more questions. If that was the case, I feel like maybe I taught something that was too complicated, so I didn't know my audience, or I did a poor job teaching it where there was so many unanswered questions, right? So I'm not going to say if you're watching this and you go to one of my classes and someone's asked two questions, don't be like, oh, okay, I'm not going to be the guy that asks a third. No, ask it. It's going to be a signal to me, okay, I need to fine tune this. And your question will then become part of my frequently asked questions, common mistakes, right? Because I know obviously there's people that train with me that watch this, so I don't want to dissuade anyone from asking me questions, and don't feel self-conscious like, oh, if somebody's already asked a question, I don't want to level a counter up. It's fine, but it's for me. Like, that means I need to improve, right? Now, again, the technical demonstration itself should be about about 5 minutes, and the actual repetition, the move, again, it kind of depends on the class, right? If everybody picked it up really well, it might only take another 5 minutes, and then everybody got the move down. Or maybe it might be even just 3 minutes, and everybody's like, I look around the room, no one has questions, everybody's doing really well. Okay, we can speed up the class so we can get to more technique instruction, right? But if I see people struggling, okay, then we'll take some more time. Or if I see people really struggling, I will stop and we'll go over the technique again, addressing the specific issues I'm seeing around the mat, right? So if I see like, oh, there's a real problem here, okay, let me highlight this issue since I see more than one person having this, and we can then break how the demonstration to go again. I have lesson plans, so I do have an idea of how long a class should take and how many techniques I expect to cover, but it's not rigid, right? If I find that I didn't plan the class as well as I thought, I'll teach less, right? As far as less techniques, right? As long as the techniques I teach get learned well. So that's more important to me than trying to cover a lot or stick to this rigid schedule that I created. The lesson plan is a guide. It's not a must, right? And I guess I haven't mentioned it before, but obviously now I have. You should have a lesson plan if you're a coach, right? You should be able to outline how your class is going to be structured, so when people show up, you're prepared. You don't want to be one of these guys that you're like looking at YouTube videos as you're driving to the gym to figure out, get some inspiration for what to teach. Like, be a professional, and it doesn't take long, especially if you've been coaching for many years. You probably have a repertoire of techniques, and you should have a curriculum, ideally if you have your own gym, so that you can be able to teach off this curriculum. And the curriculum usually is going to rotate, right? Because you could have a couple years worth of content, and you can just repeat this over time, and you could rotate it by week, you could rotate it by month, right? Or at my gym, we rotate by month, so we give a lot of focus into one specific area of combat for all the 3 disciplines, for the striking, for the wrestling, for the grappling, and that's plenty, right? In any case, having a lesson plan is going to make you a better coach because you'll be prepared. And you'll know, okay, if I have to cut stuff out because I'm running long, that's fine. Or, if I need more content because I underestimated how quick of the learners my students are, then I can just roll that into doing more drilling, right? Or more situational rounds. Anyhow, since I mentioned that, let's jump to the next step. After technical instruction, situational rounds are a great follow-up. And the reason being, let me back up a little bit. And I've mentioned this a few times, but since it's going to be relevant, I should mention it again. To me, the way I perceive the learning process, there are 4 phases of learning: observation, practice, drilling, sparring. Observation is in the word. I see coach teaching the move, demonstrating it. I watch it on a YouTube video. I remember something that I saw. I'm observing a technique, right? And all that observation does, it allows me to see and create a vision and a concept of the move in my head. When I practice, I try to turn that concept in my head into a physical reality. This is a clumsier process. It requires some thinking, going back and forth with your partner, trying to figure out how to do the move. It's not very smooth, but you're practicing, right? And our goal is to, again, get the mental concept of a technique into a physical reality. Drilling is when we refine whatever concept that we had that we've made into a physical reality and now try to speed it up, make it faster, make it cleaner, make it smoother. It's not going to be perfect, but each time we drill, we're going to get better and better at it. And again, I'll outline drilling in another podcast, the next podcast actually, I'll focus on that. But drilling is where you build speed, is your strength, you build timing, and you clean up the technique, right? So the final phase is sparring, and sparring is the feedback loop. And what happens when you spar, I'm going to try the move, it's going to either succeed or it's going to fail, and after the sparring, I'm going to observe, back to step one, in my memory, what happened. What worked, what didn't work. Step two, we practice out the mistake, right? Whatever mistakes we made, we fix them. Step three, we drill the new model that we have created in our head for this technique. Step four, we spar, we retest. And then we go on, and this is an eternal cycle. So I believe each phase is very important. And if you heard my post about the ecological approach, that was my critique. They've killed essentially two elements, the observation, well actually three, the observation, the practice, and the drilling, and they just do sparring, right? Well, I guess technically they do have some observation, so it's just 1 and 4, right? Because they're sparring and then they're trying to think what they did wrong, and then they're just going back to sparring again. And I feel the middle two are critical. Anyhow, this brings me up to, we did our warm-up, 5 minutes. We can do drilling if we want, 5-10 minutes. We do technical instruction, 25, 30 minutes, maybe 20, 30 minutes. Again, depending on the length of the class. Now we go into situational rounds, right? So these could be situational drills. These also could be situational live rounds, right? Or situational sparring. Depends on what you're trying to do. The difference between what I would call a drill and what I would call sparring is that a drill is going to be rehearsed. We know what we're going to do to each other. Sparring is chaotic. We have free will. We can do what we want, right? So with a situational drill that we might do after technique session, I might just be putting you in a position where, again, let's say we're doing kimuras. I'll say, okay, you're going to start from side control and your partner's going to give you, some resistance. Your goal is to pin the wrist, hit the kimura. And we might just do those reps right there. And that would be more of a semi-static drill. Your partner's giving you some light resistance just so you work on isolating the wrist and getting a clean submission. That could be useful there, right? Or we might do what's more common in this phase would be a situational sparring round where now I'm going to say, I'm going to start you from side mount, and your goal is to try to find kimuras, right? I don't want you trying to mount. I don't want you trying to go to kasekatame. I want you trying to isolate the wrist and control it. Depending on how many constraints you want to put on it, like the ecological guys would do, I might say you're going to start with the wrist pin, right? So you have a leg up. And if I'm doing that, I'm basically giving you a lot more opportunity to get into that kimura because I'm giving you the first step, right? Which was, in my case, when I teach it, is pin the wrist. So I'm already giving you advantage. And I might even have to give you more advantage. Maybe I'm going to start you have the grip fully locked on, and now you have to work for a finish, and your partner's going to try to break the grip or move the grip to his waist, all right, and then force you to do a step over Kimura instead. So you can use all the different constraints to make the situational round more likely to succeed. And it's a sparring round, so again, has an element of chaos to it, but those constraints are allowing you to minimize the probability of something going off the rails, right? Like obviously, if I said the only submission you do is Kimura, nobody should be doing an armbar or, and then a condo choke or anything like that, right? Like it's strictly Kimura. So we know that. And as far as the bottom guy, I can also put constraints on him. Like I'm saying, you can't do any submissions. You're just trying to escape the submission, right? That's it. As long as you can get your grip free, you break it. So this type of situational sparring is safer because there's not a lot of randomness, right? Whereas when we're doing open sparring, you have every possibility available to you, so it's a lot more chaotic, right? And plus, if I want you to get to that Kimura from top side control, that implies that you're going to take the guy down, pass their guard, get into top side control, and then pin the wrist. So I'm asking you to do a lot. How many times are you going to be able to do that in a real sparring match? Maybe once or twice if you're really good, right? That you're going to be able to take the guy down and within a 5-minute round and be able to pass their guard, score side control, right? But that's the benefit of the situational round, is that we're going to put you there, so you're going to get lots of exposure very quickly to this position, and you already know the ideal shape and form and pattern that can produce victory. So to me, that situational round is very useful for building skills quick, especially when people are learning, because of course, it's one thing to practice a technique and to drill a technique, but if you never actually tested it in a live environment, it's a different animal. So very important, right? So again, that's not my critique about the ecological approach. That is useful. My issue is that you're going into it without full understanding of what you really should be trying to accomplish, right? You should have a good winning pattern when you go into the live, so you know what to reproduce, right? Versus trying to figure out what to reproduce in vivo, right? They're a lot scarier that way. In my opinion, a little bit more dangerous too. Anyhow, for situational rounds, whether it's drilling or sparring, I would say, again, you could dedicate, depending how long the class is, I think at least 10 minutes there, right? If it's a longer class, maybe 15, maybe 20, right? But sometimes you can just conceivably do all situational sparring. But I like having at least one open sparring, round. So if we're looking at an hour class, let's see the time counter. I've done 5 minutes of warm up. I did, let's say, another 5 minutes of drilling. So that gave me 10. I do, let's say, 25 minutes of technique instruction. Now that puts me at 35. I do 10 minutes of situational rounds. That's 45. That's good, and I could even push that to 15 if I wanted to. The final session of the class to me is going to be the sparring, right? And now, again, depending on how much time I have left, in this case, if I have 10 minutes, I can do 2 5-minute rounds. I could do 1 10-minute round, just depending on how I break up my rounds. And we could finish the round out sparring. And ideally, my students are not completely exhausted doing a sparring round. If I wore them out thoroughly earlier, in my opinion, the sparring round becomes a bit more dangerous now. When do people get hurt? When they're tired, right? Why? Because your coordination's weaker, your technique starts to drop off because you're not all up there in your brain, and you just don't have enough energy to move the way you want to, so you tend to make compensatory movements, which are not great. It's rare when you see people get hurt at the beginning of practice, right? Like that's, not to say it never happens, but it's very rare. I know personally, the times I got hurt is usually like the last round, right? That's almost always the case with me. Like, why? Because especially when you're training really hard, you're building up a lot of fatigue. In some cases, I've developed cramps towards the end because I'm starting to get dehydrated. All sorts of things that happen, if you're being worked really hard. So it's important as a coach that you can also recognize signs of fatigue that people are having. If you feel people are getting really beat up, in my mind, especially if you're not working with a pro team or whatnot, there's times where you're trying to build toughness, right? So you are going to want to push them close to that breaking point, right, to test their mettle. But if you do that every day, you're going to end up breaking people, right? I feel toughness challenges should be done infrequently, right? You don't want to test people's toughness every day. That's, in my opinion, stupid, right? But it's good to test it once in a while. And usually when we do testy things, we want to try to make it so that it's in situations where it's not very chaotic, right? Like doing a toughness challenge off situational rounds is a lot safer because I already know the potential outcomes, right? So there's not a lot of ways this guy could get hurt, but if we're doing a MMA fight from the feet and the guy's exhausted, there's a lot of ways that can go wrong, right? Again, that's personal preference, but in my opinion, I don't want broken toys, right? I don't want to hurt my soldiers in training. That's the worst thing that could happen, right? We're training them to not get hurt. So if I can recognize that I've created too much fatigue quickly, then I might not go as many rounds of sparring, or I can change out the sparring so there's a lot more rest. And how you can do that, rather than pardoning everybody in groups of 2, I can make groups of 4, and we can do a shark bait round, right? Where one guy's working, and then, 2 guys will be working, but then 2 guys will be resting. So it's a little bit more intense in the beginning, but then there's a good amount of rest interval in consequent rounds. And you could find ways of making it creative there, right? Lots of different ways of doing sparring there. That's one of them, right? And that's a common one that lots of people do in jiu-jitsu, the shark bait rounds. It's good psychologically because as the guy in the middle, you feel the most pressure because you're facing fresh opponents on every interval. And at the same time, the guys on the outside get to take advantage of somebody who's a little bit more fatigued, and they generally try to overwhelm the guy with explosiveness. So it can work both ways there. But you can find different ways of doing that. And if all else fails, if you feel like they're really pushed beyond the limit, you could then do, simple games. You can go back to drills, right? That's not a bad way to end a class also, and just drilling. Again, I would say if you felt like they were really broken down towards the end of class, I don't want to break people, right? I want them close to the breaking point, but if I break them, that means, in my mind, when I say break, I mean they got hurt, right? So you want to push the envelope of what they think they can do, but without breaking them, right? I want them to feel that wall, they were able to push the wall, right? Or, and get beyond what they thought was possible without destroying it. Because obviously, if they get hurt, then the wall was there for a reason, right? So, it depends how hard you run your classes, right? You just gotta, just something to look out for, right? If you find that you're racking up a lot of injuries, that might be the reason why. You might be overtraining them, right? You're putting too much fatigue, not giving enough rest, right? You have to find ways of giving recovery time, right? There's times where we're trying to push conditioning, and I feel those are safer in drills. When we're doing sparring, particularly an open sparring session, being very fatigued is a dangerous state to be in. Just think about in the fight, because that's what we're simulating. If you're in a fight and you're very tired, you're at your most vulnerable, right? That's not the ideal condition that you would want to enter in a fight. So just something to keep in mind. So we go through everything. Warm up, drills, technique instruction, situational drilling or situational sparring. If I need to sub the sparring, I can also add drilling at the end, right? Just as a way to close out. Or if you really wanted to work on more stamina, I can do conditioning at the end also. Maybe I put them on the bag and have them do volume on the heavy bag, or maybe I have them do sprints or some other calisthenic thing if I really want to focus on conditioning. I can close out the class that way. And again, the more controlled that activity is, the safer it's going to be, right? Now, if you're running like a beginner class, 60 minutes, chances are you're probably not going to be running into the issues I'm talking about. But I'm thinking more when I run fight classes, they're 90 minutes long, right? There's a lot going on there. You can definitely fatigue people a lot more. So there is the possibility of getting people hurt, especially in a fight camp as they get towards the end. You have to be a little bit more cautious, right? So that's when I like to throw more drilling in than sparring, right? The sparring is the dangerous part. The drilling is very safe. Can't recall once where I've hurt myself drilling or I've seen someone get hurt drilling. Sparring, well, that's pretty much the only way I've been hurt in training. So when you're in a fight camp, you gotta have that in mind as the coach, right? And protect your athletes. And you have to remember your athletes can be tough and you want them tough, but they won't tell you when they're hurt, especially if it's not serious. It's not to the point where it's like a bone sticking out or they blew out their knee, but they're starting to wear out a little bit. You have to kind of be able to recognize from your fighters when something's going on. Like I was just talking to my neighbor, and he has a son that plays baseball, and apparently he didn't know, but his son's shoulder had been really sore because he's a catcher. So they take a lot of shoulder damage because they're also throwing the ball a lot. Because pretty much they throw the ball more than anyone else since they have to catch any strike and be able to throw it to first base or whatnot. So, but the coach asked him, hey, how long has his shoulder been bothering him? He's like, what shoulder? He's like, oh yeah, he's got a shoulder issue right now. So they end up having to bench him for the next few games, and now the son's upset. But like, and I told him it's a good thing that shows that your son's tough and he's game, right? He wants to be a winner, but you also have to recognize that that comes with a price, right? You have to be able to protect him from himself in a way, right? Like I don't want my fighter to have the tendency that they want to quit on themselves, right? Like no, I'll be the one that quits for them, right? I'll throw in the towel versus my fighter to tap out, right? That would be preferable, right? He doesn't have it in him to quit. So I know he's 100% locked in. So that's going to happen in training too, though. So you have to be able to recognize that. And I know I've had plenty of times where I have to throw in the towel for people in training, where they sometimes get caught in the submission and they just don't want to tap, and I'm tapping for you, right? Or I see someone that's overly fatigued, I'm like, you're going to sit out this round, right? So I feel the coaching responsibility is serious. You're not just casual or lazy, right? I'm not going to be like, oh, I teach the moves and now let me get on my phone and start looking up the next move I'm going to teach, right? Like that to me is a very poor instructor, right? A good instructor, he's vigilant. And in my opinion, teaching is a bit taxing because I'm putting a lot of attention, right? Not only to what I'm teaching, but also around making sure that all the students are replicating the movements right. I'm able to identify problem points when they're executing a technique and also recognize safety issues, making sure that nobody, people don't fall on top of each other or go out of bounds or someone's not being put in a potentially dangerous position. So you're on guard, and I feel especially when you have bigger classes, you probably should have more people watching, like have an assistant instructor be able to also watch the class, because obviously if you have a class of 30 people, you can't watch all 30 of them at the same time, right? So, typically if I could look one way, I could see maybe half the class and then someone else ideally monitoring the other half of the class, so together we can watch over everybody. And I feel that it's going to keep, not only technically you're going to have more eyes so that you can catch more issues with technique performance, but also for safety, you're able to monitor more and make sure that nobody gets hurt, right? That's, last thing I almost forgot. At the very end of all this, it's always good to talk to the class at the end, right? What my brother calls a mat chat, which you could sum up everything that happened during the class. You could also talk about things that are not related to the class, but that give value to the students. You know, whether it be about how this might apply in a self-defense situation, or you might talk about something that you saw happen during the class that was motivating or useful, like you saw someone escape something and you could make a parable out of it, right? To give some extra value. And again, people are tired at this point, so they're probably fine with getting the little breather. And again, not long, maybe a couple minutes at most, but just something else to impart knowledge that you have. If you, again, as an instructor, you are a leader to these people. So hopefully, besides leading them through martial arts practices, you could also lead them to the what I consider are like the ethics, the morals that I feel the martial arts comes with, right? You know, whether that's being disciplined or being a good Samaritan, protecting, you know, the people around you and your family and your friends, things like of this nature, right? These are things, and you know, they might help you in teaching class. Like if you see a lot of people coming late, you could explain something about the importance of showing up on time and why, you know, not just besides coming to the gym, but for everything in life. When you show up late, what you're really saying is this activity is not that important, right? That's the truth of it, by the way. Which is why, like when on Friday, I think it was Jasmine Rocha was saying that you shouldn't penalize people for being late. I disagree with that, right? To me, showing up late is a lack of respect for the activity that you're showing up late to. And a little sidetrack, but I brought it up, so I might as well go into it. If I told you if you show up to class on time, you're going to win $100 million, are you going to show up to the gym 1 second before? Or are you going to come like an hour early, or maybe 2 hours early, and maybe you even sleep over at the gym so you're sure you're there on time? Because if it's me, I'm going to sleep over. I'll be like a homeless in front of the gym. And I'm like, I'm not missing this thing for the world, right? Like, I want to make sure I'm late. I don't want any traffic getting in the way. I don't want my car to break down. Like, I got to be here to collect that $100 million, right? Why? Because it's very important, right? That would be life-changing for most people. But when you show up late, it's because you felt like whatever you were doing previous to this was more important than what you're going to be doing there. Now, that might be true, especially in the case of an emergency, right? Obviously, like if your child is in danger and you have to show up late, obviously very understandable, right? But that's not what usually people show up late for, right? Like, oh, they woke up late, or they took a detour, or something happened with work and they show up late to class, right? So to me, it's important, and you can explain those things, because if you're somebody who's continuously late, it's not. It's one thing you have a one-off time that you show up late. Shit happens. But if you're late to everything you do, that's not an accident. That's a trend in your behavior, right? And in my opinion, you need to address that. So if you're somebody who's chronically tardy, you should figure out what's going on, how you can prioritize your activities so you show up on time. Personally, I always like showing up early, right? People know, like, I usually come very early because I either warm up there or I warm up at home, and then I have to drive to the gym early. So I always want to be showing up, whether I'm teaching or I'm a student, early. Anyhow, that's like an example of something you could talk about with a mat chat, right? And lots of topics you can talk about. Not a requirement, but it's a good time to feed people some extra knowledge that is not strictly martial arts related. If you have that type of knowledge on you. If you don't, then you can just use that as a time to announce things, right? If you have any events coming up, if there's a tournament coming up you want people to get through, maybe you have some new gear coming into the gym that you want to sell, right? Or there's a belt test, or whatever the case is, that's a good time to promote it, since you're at the end of the class before you sign off. So that's a good time for you to give value to your students, whether it's about teaching them something new, a concept, some new philosophy, maybe a book to read or a movie to watch. Maybe there's something you taught in the class that you would like for them to watch, like what I said the other day. Oh, like Adesanya knocked someone out with this beautiful kick. guys, homework, go watch this fight. You can see it here, whatever, and come back with it because we'll talk more about this in the next class, right? Find ways to give value to people besides just on the mat. Give them homework, right? If you can. Not everybody has to do it. It's not a requirement, but it's a bonus, right? So I feel like it's a good use. Now, let's talk about everything, right? Quick warm-up, some drilling, technical instruction, situational rounds, sparring, or more drilling, or conditioning, or combination, and then our mat chat to close off the class. That would be an ideal way of me structuring a class and teaching it. That would be the ideal. Do I always do that? I'll be honest, not always, but I'm usually close to it. That's usually what I'm trying to get at, right? We're not all perfect. We make mistakes, but me just talking about all this, for my next few classes, I'll make sure to do it. Again, I'm going to be in Miami next week. I already have the lesson plan for the classes I'm teaching, so this stuff is already in there, right? I already have everything planned in, how the drills I'm going to do, the techniques I'm going to show, and what I'm going to talk about. So I'm already prepared for those classes, and I feel like everybody should do the same. Even in the most cases nowadays here, I'm a substitute, teacher for the most part, and I just, train and do private lessons and stuff like that. And I still come in with lesson plans. For me, I have taught now for 20 plus years, and I save all the lesson plans on my computer. So I have hundreds of lesson plans. So it's very easy for me to come up with them at this point, right? Because I could just literally pull up an old one, or I could come up with a new one. I take notes when I attend classes as well, which is another matter. Just like as the instructor, I'm prepared, right? I come into the class with a plan. As a student, in my opinion, you should be taking notes. This could be on pen and paper, which was the old school way that I used to do it, and I had journals of just notes. Nowadays, I just type it into my phone. And it doesn't have to be while the class is going on. Your teacher might think you're looking on TikTok or something like that, and he might not appreciate that. But if you explain it to him, or otherwise, I usually do it after class. So once the class is over, I whip out the phone and I start typing in my phone my notes. And I have on a Google Sheet or a Google Doc, I just write everything down. So I have like an ongoing journal of all the notes and the things that I've learned. So I can also use that as a resource as well. Anyhow, that's all I got for you guys this week. That's how I would structure the class. That's my concept of what I consider the traditional model of teaching. If you think that is not the traditional model, let me know, because I think that's I think all the coaches that I attended from, going into wrestling and my mixed martial arts, I felt that was very close to the model I have. Not all those elements, but most of those elements. And my brother, he put a lot of thought into making better coaching programs. And there's a lot more detail that can go into it. So if you're interested in that, send me an email, because he has particular coaching programs that go into very explicit detail on the fine points of technical instruction and whatnot. And it's not necessarily not the techniques itself that you're teaching, but how you teach, right? It's an art in itself. But at least as a general game plan, I think this gives you a better idea of how a class that I feel is a proven model that works really well could be run. And whether, like I said, it's an hour long or a 90-minute class, I would structure the same way. And by the way, I wouldn't run a class longer than 90 minutes personally. I feel it's not that productive at that point. You're either overtraining your athlete, or you're training at such a low rate that they could train indefinitely. And either way, and that means I'm not pushing envelopes. I feel 90 minutes is kind of like the peak of I can make a class very intense, but not make it a marathon either. And this is similar if I'm training pro athletes or if I'm training, a casual student. I believe technical instruction should always be there. If you're not introducing your professional athletes to new technique, in my opinion, you're doing a disservice to them. And there's quite a few gyms that do that, right? And I've been around the block quite a bit, and I sometimes see that like pro practices are just lots of drilling and a lot of sparring, which is fine. There's sometimes where you have sparring classes, and we do that as well, where we're just focusing on sparring. But if every class is that way, then there's a problem, right? Because then there's no room for growth, right? You're just getting better at what you know, which has an incremental value, but again, diminishing returns. Right? If I'm a guillotine master and all I do every day is guillotines, yeah, am I getting a little better? Sure. But is that the quickest path to growth in all areas of my game? Probably not, right? There's probably going to be a lot of holes in my game if I just became a pure specialist at one thing and never veered outside the box. And as a coach, I'm trying to expand my athletes' awareness of all the different techniques. And I should be sharing my experiences with them. That's why I don't like the ecological approach. I feel like it removes the responsibility of sharing your experience, which is one of our inherent advantages. Right? I can easily share experience with people. Other animals don't really have the means of doing that, right? I don't believe they have the vocalizations or whatnot to go into very deep theory. Sure, birds and, certain mammals can make grunts and sounds that communicate danger or food or basic things, but I don't think they're breaking down like explicit strategies or whatnot. Maybe they are. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think that's what's really happening, right? We have that advantage where we can communicate very complex ideas to each other fairly easily just by voice. So it seems like a waste of, if you have somebody who's been in the game for decades, and you're not going to capitalize on all that experience. So I feel as a coach, that's why technical instruction has a place in every athlete's journey, whether you're a beginner student or you're UFC world champion. You should be learning new skills, because guess what? If you're not learning new skills, people are going to study you, and over time, they're going to break you down. Right? And since you haven't adapted, you're easier to break because you're a fixed target now. That's why, to me, certain athletes, excuse me, certain athletes, once they reached the top, they got toppled and then never really recovered. And then there's other athletes that managed to stay on top forever. The few that come into my head, Georges St. Pierre, guy is training. He's not even fighting anymore, and he's still training. He's growing and he's learning new skills in gymnastics and whatnot, and but he's always training. I've seen him go to New Wave a bunch of times. I've seen him go and train all over the world. He's a real martial artist, in my opinion. Probably one of the best role models that we have. Mighty Mouse, another example. Guy that's still training, right? I think he retired from fighting, but now he's pursuing grappling. He's still learning, right? Like, love him or hate him, John Jones, the guy that still building skills. He's, even though I don't think he's a great role model, as an athlete, the guy's phenomenal, right? And dangerous everywhere. So these are people that are not just resting on their laurels and like, okay, I reached the top, that means I don't have to learn anymore. No, now you got to learn more, because now you're the top guy. Everybody's studying you. They're going to try to figure out how to break that puzzle that is you. And over time, if you're not evolving, they're going to figure it out. It's just a matter of time. But if you're constantly evolving, you're a moving target. Now it's hard to get a fix on you, because you're like, okay, the guy I was starting to beat, he's now here, and I was aiming here, right? This is a trickier fight now, because I have to make this adjustment to fight this guy. And then if you move again after your next fight, you're like, damn, this guy is growing, and I'm trying to catch up to him, but he's still moving up, right? So, in my opinion, if you're a top fighter, you need to continue rising, right? And my point being, there's always room for technical instruction. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you all next week.